Hi, this is Victor Agreda Jr., and this week on Coders, I am in San Francisco, California, here at the Apple Worldwide Developer Conference.
CommScope, thinking beyond today's technology to help you make the best decision for your network and your business. Telecom Careers, the #1 global telecom and wireless job board, telecomcareers.com.
Hi, it's Victor Agreda Jr., and welcome to this week's episode of Coders. I've been in San Francisco all week covering the Worldwide Developer Conference here in San Francisco. Of course, this is Apple's big chance to say to all its developers, here are the great tools that we've been creating for you. This year, Tim Cook came on stage and then quickly handed it off to a number of people that he works with, starting with Craig Federighi, who looked at OS X. This new version of OS X called El Capitan is sort of like Snow Leopard in that it's an interim step that gets rid of some of the bugs and issues that people had with the previous version, which was Yosemite. In particular, the company said that they're focusing on performance and experience upgrades. Also, a number of new features were shown in iOS 9 that will pay off both on the iPhone and the iPad. But perhaps most significantly with iOS, we saw the introduction of split-screen apps and true multitasking, including video that works as picture-in-picture. This isn't going to be supported on all of the hardware that's currently out there, but it will be supported on most. And iOS 9 will actually be supported on every device that's been supported by iOS 8. So that's an excellent thing for developers who already have a deployed code base. Another thing that the company focused heavily on was the watch. And watchOS will finally be able to run native applications on the watch. And what that means is that you will no longer need to be tethered to an iPhone to actually run code. The code will run directly on the watch. There are some looming questions about things like battery life and other aspects, but it is really going to be a boon for developers who are able to deploy apps that we've not seen before. And it's reminiscent of the fact that the iPhone launched without an app store and people were using web apps originally. There were many other announcements, such as Swift going open source and a number of improvements and enhancements, plus some new apps like News that I think that for third-party developers maybe wasn't so important. Swift going open source, however, was a big deal because they didn't even use the GPL license. So Apple is not exactly the biggest fan of the Free Software Foundation, but more importantly, the license that Swift will be using going forward will allow people like Microsoft to take that code, modify it, change it, and release it, and could even put it into commercial products. So what we're going to see is a real explosion in Swift, both on the client side and on the server side. And that's where things get really interesting. Now here are some developers and media folks to tell us what they thought were the biggest announcements.
Hi, my name is Leander Caney, and I'm the editor and publisher of cultofmac.com, and that's a blog devoted to Apple and the Apple user community. And so I was asked about what did I think was the biggest thing for developers at WWDC this week during the keynote announcement, and I guess it was the open sourcing of Swift, Apple's programming language. And the open sourcing is important because I guess it turns it into it releases Apple of ownership, and what might turn it into a standard. And it stands a lot more chance of being taken up and adopted by other companies, even its competitors. Microsoft or Google could pick it up and run with it because Apple has relinquished control and ownership of it by opening it up. And that's important because the more people that use it, the more developers there are, the more it's going to turn into the thing that's taught in schools, in colleges, and all the upcoming programs that use it. And hopefully there'll be some more apps that are created with this programming language.
Hi, I'm Roby. I'm from Attentive, and I think the biggest thing coming out of the keynote was clearly Swift being open source. I think it's a very developer-friendly stance that tells you exactly where they want us to be spending our time. And I think secondary in the State of the Union, they spend a lot of time focusing on some of the optimizations and performance work that's going to help us all do a better job, and that was pretty awesome to see.
I'm Samuel Goodwin with Roundwell Software. And the thing I think is most important about the keynote yesterday is the open sourcing of Swift, which I think is going to be a big deal. I know some people that are very active about reporting a lot of bugs and have a lot of things to say about it. And if they can just contribute patches instead of just complaining all the time, then I'm sure they'll be pumped with that, and I'll be pumped with that. And then also they're adding the ability to do user or UI testing from the existing testing framework, where before you had to go to some weird JavaScript thing and do some extra stuff that wasn't related. But now it can all be running through the same system, through the same automation process, and work a lot better. There was something that did something like this before, but it was like an add-on that you had to add and get it to work and hope that the people continue to maintain it. It makes a lot of sense to just have it coming directly from Apple, where they're responsible for the platform and the tools, so it works great for them to do it.
Hi, my name is Scott Gardner. I'm the developer of Loke, a location-based social networking app. I also wrote a book called Transitioning to Swift that I started day one of Swift last year. And watching the keynote today or yesterday, the two things that excited me most about what's coming are the native Watch OS. I'm excited to develop an app for Apple Watch, and I haven't done so yet. And I think this will really move the ball forward for us as developers to do that. And secondly, Swift being open source. I'm really excited about that. I can't wait to see what we can do with this in Linux and just the embracement of the open source community that Apple's reaching out to by doing this. So those are the two things that excited me most about the keynote.
So I'm Saul Mora. I'm an iOS developer. I'm also a podcaster on the NS Brief podcast. And I think the biggest takeaway from yesterday's keynote was the open source of Swift. So when they announced that Swift is open source, you heard the loud applause. It was it's really quite a big moment. You never know when Apple's going to open source something, and it's quite surprising and welcome that they decided to open source Swift. I think it'll have a big impact not only on client and mobile apps, but it'll have a big impact on server-side apps, and also getting Swift onto things like Windows. For as much as we don't like Windows, it'll have a big impact there, and on Linux and other platforms there. So getting Swift in the hands of many other developers and making that a real industry standard seems to be the way Apple wants things, and they want to lead the way, so they can only do that by open sourcing it. So I think that's a really big deal, and it got a real good innovation for a really good reason.
All right, my name is Arthur Matosian. I'm the CEO and co-founder of FIBO, and I thought the keynote was great. My biggest takeaways from that were WatchOS. I think it's going to make it a lot better for developers to build high-quality apps for the watch. And the other piece that I really enjoyed was open sourcing of Swift. I think that for the future of code, that's going to be a really big deal, and it's going to really take that to the next level, I think. So yeah, and I'm also personally really excited about Apple Music. I mean, I'm definitely looking forward to trying that out, and I think that it was good this year they focused on doing more updates and housekeeping stuff, and not so many new features for iOS 9 and OS 10. So overall, it was great. I'm excited to dig in with the code and see what's going on, and I'm really looking forward to next year.
Hi, my name is Kelly Gamont. I work for Smile Software, and I write occasionally over at the Mac Observer. And the thing that I thought was the most important to come out of the keynote was that this was a bolt tightening release. Snow Mountain, I started calling it. We'll see if that's the thing that catches on. But I think the thing that is the most useful for developers out of that is that there's not a bunch of change, and the sand has shifted less under everybody's feet this time. So it makes it a lot more efficient to going forward, that you don't have to overhaul everything in order to rebuild. Everything that everyone is doing is going to get a little bit of a performance boost automatically by virtue of the new operating system and the way that those frameworks are working. And there's not a ton of new stuff to have to learn, and there's not a bunch of extra sort of gyration that everything's going to have to go through in the name of progress. And it's sort of was scaled back on the new features as far as what was user-facing stuff. Here's all these new things you have to worry about, and then more about we're going to take all of the things that we have and just make them really good. And so I thought that was probably the most useful thing that came out, at least for developers. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot new and exciting in the operating system as a user, and I'm kind of glad of that because I've run into some of the rough edges of Yosemite. So I'm really hopeful that it won't be too huge a change for users either. It will just end up being a better experience all around.
Hello, my name is Cesare. I'm an independent developer. At the moment, I'm working on a service which is called appversion.io. And I got a lot of excitement from yesterday's keynote, especially because I got a sense of Apple getting more open.
So clearly, the most evident thing was the announcement of Swift getting open source in the fall. But also, for example, yesterday I was checking the CloudKit APIs, and now you can access Apple's web services using JavaScript. So again, this confirms my suspicion that Apple is getting more open, and that's good.
My name is Neil Tixon. I'm the editor-in-chief and publisher of MacTech Magazine, and Victor's asked me to give you an idea of what my thoughts are about Apple's announcements yesterday at the WWDC Keynote 2015. And it was an interesting keynote because, in my mind, there was 4 main points. I mean, obviously, there was the announcements about Apple Music, and a lot of the media picked up that, especially on the consumer side and the mass media side. And of course, there was Apple's continuous jabs at Google over privacy and how important that was in the Apple market. Those were 2 of the 4 points that I saw. The third point, which is of particular importance to developers, is Swift, and what Swift 2.0 is going to do, how they're going to be making it that much better, how they're going to be making it that much easier and faster for people to learn, how much more capable it's going to be, how much more efficient it's going to be, and of course, it's huge. It's going to be open source. Now, I'm sure that Apple's probably is going to keep back a little bit of what Swift does in some ways in order to make it their solution on Apple technologies, but to have it available on Linux, and hopefully somebody will pick it up and do something on the Windows side, is going to be pretty spectacular, and it will make it that much easier for people to come into the market and do things, and maybe even do it across different platforms out there as well. So that was huge. The rest of the keynote, though, probably 2/3 of it was around one topic in my mind. Now, yes, they talked about iOS 9 and they talked about the next version of OS 10 and it being El Capitan, and I found that very interesting. But if you look at those announcements along with watchOS, the thing that was the most interesting thing was that Apple today gives APIs to developers to go develop things in a whole variety of ways. Some great tools, some great access, some great abilities to use the OS to do a variety of things. And what Apple said about all those other OSs and announcements is that they're going to give an API, or in this case really a UI, to the users that are out there for them to control their life in all the different aspects. I call this control kit, if you will. And yeah, it's not an API, as I said, but the idea is that people are going to want to control things like their health and their home and their auto. They're going to want to be controlling the devices and understanding with their calendars and scheduling and all those types of things that we do a lot of today. But Apple wants you to do all those different things through an Apple device. And that was the essence of what we saw yesterday for about 2/3 of the keynote. Probably the most significant things that happen for not just the users, but for the developers, as it'll enable them to have a lot more opportunities to control a lot more things. And if they seize that opportunity, they'll be able to ride the wave and trend that Apple's creating during this time.
Hi, my name is Charles Perry, and I'm the owner of Medikite Software. I think the biggest thing that came out of the keynote for me was the fact that there wasn't anything big that came out of the keynote. The fact that we're all going to be able to catch our breath after 2 years of really revolutionary changes. So I'm looking forward to finally being able to catch up on some of the features that have been introduced and maybe get my apps in a somewhat more finished state. So thanks.
Hi, I'm Dana Nuon. I'm an iOS developer. I'm here at WWDC, actually AllConf, since I didn't get a badge. The keynotes, I wasn't really impressed with anything. There were no surprises. We're all looking forward to the Apple TV, but that didn't happen. Everyone was looking forward to that as the one more thing, but I think we were let down by the Apple Music announcement. I actually I was more impressed with the State of the Union actually in the afternoon than the keynote. So I'm really looking forward to having native apps on the Apple Watch. And as a developer of fitness apps, I'm really looking forward to accessing the sensors on the Apple Watch, such as the heart rate sensor. So I'm looking forward to going back and playing with the new tools.
Hi, I'm Joe Shponsky. I am a developer and designer. I work with Brain Interactive. We're a very small company that makes teleprompter software for the Mac OS and iOS platforms. And I thought the most important thing coming out of the keynote was some of the really, really cool new stuff for the iPad. I think it was great to see Apple start focusing again on some, the multitasking and other things to make the iPad a unique device. And I'm hopeful that reinvigorates Apple's commitment to the platform there. And hopefully we'll see some new hardware in the fall that'll coincide with that.
Hey, my name is Peter Cohen. I'm Mac Managing Editor at imore.com.
And I'm very excited about some of the stuff that was announced at the keynote. Being a Mac guy, of course, the stuff about El Capitan was what interested me the most. Metal for OS 10 is a real game changer, and literally a game changer, because for years, people who play games on the Mac have been plagued with performance issues compared to their Windows counterparts. So we don't know exactly how Metal for OS 10 is going to translate into real world performance, but based on what Apple's saying, it's certainly going to help with a lot of the problems there. Plus, it's it's doing it in a way that doesn't damage efficiency on the computers either. So your Mac won't turn into a hot brick that has a battery that disappears after 20 minutes, unlike some gaming PCs. So that's very exciting. It has a lot of applications outside of gaming because OpenGL is so crucial, not just to the core operating system, but also to so many other applications that get used. Adobe Creative Cloud, for example, was mentioned during the keynote. That absolutely is going to see some major performance increases. I think they said on stage something like 6x performance increase in some cases. So those are all really exciting things. Now I spend almost all day long in Spotlight, using it just reflexively now to open apps, to search for stuff on the web, to look at files that I've created to try to find information. So I'm very interested in some of the intelligent heuristics that they're building into Spotlight to make that a more useful thing for me and just make it more intuitive for me to find the data that I want. The split screen stuff looks really cool too, and split screen is a feature that's coming to iOS 9 in varying degrees depending on what kind of device you've got. If you've got an iPad Air 2, you're going to see a true split screen experience that's going to be pretty marvelous. Now, it's interesting, I write words for a living, and I've never really been very happy with using the iPad as a text editing device. And the problem that I've had with it all along has been that getting insertion points into the text that I'm writing and then copying and selecting and moving text around is so much more cumbersome than it is on the Macintosh because, you have to press and hold the screen and then, carefully drag out the selection that you're doing. That's changing. That's changing with gesture controls that mirror kind of what you do on a Magic Trackpad or on the trackpad on a MacBook or MacBook Pro, using two fingers instead of just one. That's really exciting to me. That is a game changer for the iPad. And then WatchOS 2.0, well, you might be able to see I'm wearing a watch. And I'm just really excited to see what Apple does with the watch next. So it was a lot of very dense information. We didn't even get to some of the real meat of what's going on in both OS 10 and iOS 9 that Apple didn't have time to talk about on the keynote. So in the coming days and weeks, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more exposed that we're going to be very excited about.
So as you can see, it's probably not surprising that the majority of developers believe that Swift going open source is the most important thing. There are a few people that said that Watch was important, but the Watch doesn't have the installed base that iOS devices do. Swift going open source represents not just an opportunity for Apple, but also kind of a paradigm shift for Apple, really. The company is not known for doing open source projects. In fact, when Safari was released and was based on KHTML and WebKit was open source, that was a big deal. When Unix was shown as OS 10, of course, that comes back from Next, but when Unix became the underpinnings of the Macintosh operating system, that was a big deal. So what we're seeing here is that Swift is positioned as the future code base for all Apple endeavors. And it's important that they get as much adoption and as much interest in Swift as possible. Open sourcing Swift means that they will achieve that goal. And the interesting thing about this is that in all the consumer-facing products that were announced, El Capitan, OS 9, and of course, Apple Music, which has nothing to do with developers. The interesting thing about this is that the biggest takeaway for most people was Swift. And that's exactly as Apple intends, because what they want to do is make sure that for the next 10, 20 years, Swift becomes the master language for its products. So it will continue to refine and perfect Swift. And now that it's open source, it will have many, many more people working on Swift to enable it to do that.
A number of other things were announced, and in fact, you can go through the posted keynote and you can see slides that have a number of other things. There were additional APIs, there were new frameworks. As usual, Apple throws a lot into what it announces at WWDC. Some of those things actually wind up in sessions that are under non-disclosure agreements, but a lot of things also happen in the State of the Union address. And I think that one of the most important things in the State of the Union address, because it addresses where Apple is right now. Apple still sells 16 gigabyte iPhones. It still sells devices that perhaps in the past had problems updating. There was a big problem with one of the iOS updates that required several gigabytes. And so what they've done in this with app developers in particular, and I think that one of the things they're trying to do to combat network congestion, is they've allowed something called app slicing. So imagine you're a developer and you're developing an app that's going to work on the iPhone, it's going to work on the iPad, and you have a number of different assets. Well, if you have someone that's pulling in something on an iPad mini that does not have a Retina display, which Apple still sells, you don't need the Retina assets. So Apple's going to allow you to say, take this binary and only apply the parts that are actually relevant to the device that it's being installed on. That's a fundamental shift. As Samuel was talking about, you'll be able to test UI in the cloud. There are a number of things that Apple's doing in the cloud that's trying to allow developers to offload some of their testing. It's also reminiscent of what Google is doing. Speaking of Google, one of the things that Apple's trying to do to differentiate itself is in privacy. And of course, at Google I/O, we saw a number of amazing demonstrations of things like Google Now. It sees your email, it sees your calendar, it sees all of these things that happen in your life, and it's doing that by data mining. Apple made a very big point to say that we are not mining your data. In fact, most of the things that it does are going to be happening local on the device. So when it looks at travel time, when it looks at other aspects that allow you to connect disparate pieces of data in your device, it's actually doing that all locally, and it's not sent to Apple, it's not aggregated, it's completely anonymous. And so Apple's drawing a very hard line in the sand here. The question remains whether they'll be able to keep that momentum going as they go forward. The future may very well be data mining, but Apple's betting that it isn't. So for this week's Coders, thank you for joining us. Please join us next week as we look a little bit more at what's going on in the world of APIs. Thanks.
Coders is a production of RCR TV News. To reach Victor Agreda Jr. or to suggest a show topic for Coders, you can reach him on Twitter at Superpixels. For all the latest news on wireless code and the whole world of wireless, check out rcrwireless.com.